you'd like to turn in your Bibles to Ruth chapter 1. We're going to be continuing in that book. Chapter 1, we're going to be looking specifically in verses 16 through 19, but I'm going to start by reading verse 1. Let me take one more moment while you're doing that and pray for me and pray for us. Father, thank you for this opportunity today to hear your voice in your word. I pray that you would help me to communicate it well. I pray that you would help us to think clearly and accurately about you. Pray that this would be a moment, this next bit here, that it would be a chance for people to hear your voice and that it would shape our view of ourselves, that it would be a comfort and an encouragement. We praise you, Jesus, that you are going to show up, that you're here. May your word go forth. In Jesus' name, amen. Life is bittersweet. Yesterday was bittersweet. Yesterday, for many of you, you know that's I had a memorial for my mom. And there were joys and there were tender moments. There were laughter. But of course, the occasion is one of tears. This is what life is, in a nutshell. You have wonderful moments, and you have moments that are hard. And this is what we're going to begin to see a little bit here in this book. We've been looking at this book of Ruth. When we think about life and pain and suffering, when we think about how to deal with that whole issue, we think of Ruth. We don't usually think of Ruth. We think of Job, don't we? Job is the book about suffering. But Ruth is too. It's typically by the way the Jews reckon how they put things together. They don't put it in the historical books like we do. They put it right next to Job in the wisdom literature. That's because it is a wisdom book. It is a book that'll tell you something about how to live life. And as we were looking at last week, well, a couple weeks ago at this point, we saw that Naomi's life was devastated. In verses 1 through 5. Let me take a moment and read that. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, and he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. The name of his 2 sons were Maon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab, and they remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the first was Orpah. The name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. And both Maon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons, their husband. Her life is devastated. And there's 3 devastations that are kind of circumstances and 3 devastations that are personal. The devastations that are kind of circumstantial is she's living in the days of the judges. It's not a good time. Go back and read through the book of Judges. It's a day of treachery. It's a time of upheaval. It's a time where life is uncertain. There's lots of sin, even by God's own people. War, famine. It's an awful time to live in the land of Israel. In addition, there was a famine. Famines are horrible things. They're things that we Americans, frankly, are very difficult grasping the enormity of what happens when a famine hits. There literally is no food. It's not that you can't get the food you like. There's no food at all, nor any possibility of more coming. It's devastating. It's one of the worst atrocities that can happen to a region is a famine. And then the third one is they go to Moab. Why Moab? Moab's is the bad place in the area. These are God's enemies. This is like a black man moving to Georgia in 1950. Bad. In addition, this is the place where nobody likes Jews. And they hate them there. So 3 circumstantial places. This is not good. But in addition, there's the 3 personal. She loses her husband. She loses both her children. Which not only is there a personal loss, but there's also a loss of security. There's no welfare there. There's no, women can't just go get a job. There's nothing for her. Poverty, no one to protect her, so insecurity and fear. And at her age, she's not going to get married again. Naomi's life is absolutely devastated. She's the character of the book. This is what this book is about. If you read through the story again, it's very clear that she's the one that's kind of driving the plot. Ruth is critical. We're going to see why. Why is it named Ruth, then, you would ask? We're going to talk about that today. But the story is about Naomi. It's about this woman who's devastated, and we're left with this issue of what is God doing? Just like Job, where we have this person whose life is devastated, and they're wrestling with what God's doing in it, how do people respond, all that sort of thing. We have the same thing here in Ruth. Only in Ruth, we don't get a little glimpse into what God is thinking. We get that in Job, but here God is silent. We don't know why God has done this to her. All we can see is from the human level what's going on. And it leaves us with questions. How do we respond when life takes a dark turn? When you lose your mom, when you lose your best friend, when you lose your job, when you lose any loved one, when the economy goes bad, when a friend betrays you. I mean, there's all of these things. How do you deal with this? And this is what this book is all about. And life is bittersweet. There's wonderful parts to life, and there's really hard things. And the older you get, doesn't it seem like it becomes more that way? You know, you can have a birth of a grandchild and the death of a lifelong friend or even your spouse all happen on the same day. This is life. Beautiful, but painful. And this is all about how do you deal with that? We're struggling with this issue with God because, as I talked about, when I went through here, some of these things Naomi chose. They chose to go to Moab. But they didn't choose the famine. They didn't choose the day they were living in. And the death of a person, God determines that. The Bible is utterly clear that when a person passes is determined by God. Jesus, no sparrow will fall to the ground apart from the will of the Father. And if that's true for you, for the sparrows, how much is it going to be true for you? That's what Jesus is saying in Matthew. Job 14 talks about how our days are numbered, that his days are numbered. God numbers your days. He knows the exact number of days and hours that you shall live and no more. Isaiah 45 talks about how God brings good and bad. You know, life is not random. God is in control. Doesn't mean we don't have responsibility. Doesn't mean that we can't affect what's going on in our lives. But there's a lot here that God is in control. This is biblical this is biblical truth. And when we look in this book, as we'll see today, Naomi rightly believes that God is behind her circumstances. She wrongly assumes God's against her, but she rightly communicates without any doubt who's at fault for this. And so we have to go to God. God, what are you doing here? How do I respond when something bad happens in my life? That's the question of the day. And if it hasn't happened already to you, it will. And for most of you, I look at you and I go, yeah, it's already happened. And some of you recently. So we're going to be looking at verses 6 through 19, the first half of 19. The first half, this first few verses has all been about kind of setting up the issue at hand. Life is painful. How is Naomi going to respond? What is God doing? How should we respond to this? Now in verse 6 through 19, the turn to a good providence occurs, but Naomi doesn't know it. It's begun. This is the turn, and this is why we will see why the book is named Ruth. Today we're going to see that. And it breaks down like this. There's a nice little outline. I will read through it, but as you can see here, you're going to have a little opening kind of narrative comment. At the end, you'll have a concluding one, and in it you have this back and forth between Naomi and her daughters. And it's first is kind of the initial request and urging by Naomi, followed by their initial response. The response of the daughters and the response of Naomi, followed by a final decision by all three. Let me read it, and then we'll go verse by verse. Verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab. For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she sent out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt kindly with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. They said to her, "No, we will return with you and to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that I may that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way. For I am too old to have a husband. And if I should say, if there was hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they're grown? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you will lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more, if anything but death parts me from you." And then Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, and she said no more. So the two of them went on till they came to Bethlehem. The opening narrative, verses 6 and 7. They're in Moab. It's sometime after the two sons had died. And for some reason, they find out that God had visited the land of promise, the land of their home, Judah, Bethlehem, and they have food again. We don't know why. There's no need to know why. The author of this has stripped out all the unnecessary details. A good short story writer, and this is considered one of the greatest short stories ever written by most literary scholars. This is a fantastic story. It's why you guys enjoy reading it so much. It's well crafted. And in this case, he's stripped out all the unnecessary stuff. You don't need to know why, other than the fact that God is the one who did it. You don't need to know how she knew. That's not the point. The point is they hear. And so she decides to go. And it's interesting. It's this word visited. The Lord visited. Seems strange, perhaps. It's a phrase that's used frequently in the Bible to describe God coming with a blessing. It's the one that was used by Zechariah describing when John the Baptist was born. that the Lord has visited his people, describing the birth of them. It's also described in Genesis 21. This is about the birth of Isaac. And it reads, the Lord had visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he promised, because he promised her a child. Verse 22, and Sarah conceived. You see how the two go together? God visited, and there's this blessing of a baby. It's interesting you should use that phrase. Because we're going to see as we go through here, she's very, very much concerned about babies. And as we see at the very end of this book, a baby is what the whole issue is about. Remember the day women needed children and a husband to take care of them. It's not that they were weak, this is the culture. They had to have this. So they decide to go. And they go off. It's about a 7 to 14-day journey, depending on where they're starting from and where they're going into the land of Judah. It's around 50 miles-ish. So it's going to take over a week, but less than 2 weeks to go there. And they start heading out there, and they're on their way. And maybe, it doesn't say exactly where, maybe on the border between the two nations, Naomi finally gets up the courage to talk, to say something that's been weighing on her. And so we have the initial conversation, the initial urging, starting in verse 8. But Naomi said to her two daughter-in-laws, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Let's pause there. Can you hear the warmth? The care? She loves her daughters-in-law. But she's been aching to tell them this. She should have probably said this back in Moab, but she didn't want to do it. It was too hard. She has become utterly dependent on these women, these two daughters. She's an older woman. She can't get remarried, as she will say. She can't provide for herself. She needs someone to help her. And so she knows that this is the case. But as we're going to see, this is not a good place for them to go. But she loves them. And so she says, you need to go home. You need to go back. She loves them. Think about this. The years, the 10 years that they had spent together, the years, the shared bond through grief. They lost their husbands, her daughter, these two daughters who were her kids, the shared grief over losing their father-in-law, the years spent working together. Oh, they love each other. And so Naomi's trying to take care of them and says, you need to go back. This is not good for you. And it makes very clear what she wants for them. If you look down there in verse 9, she says, go back to the house of her husband. They don't have husbands right now. No, she wants them to have a husband. She wants them to get married. She wants them to have children. She wants them to have a life. And she knows if you go back to Israel, you're not going to get that. It's not possible. These people hate you. This is a black man in Georgia in 1950. It ain't happening. Go back. She wants them to have children. How do I know she wants them to have children? This very strange little phrase here. Have I not been on this whole time? This strange little phrase here, go back to your mother's house. That's a strange phrase. You would think it would say, my father's house. You go back to your father's house, because it's the father who is the head of the household. It's the father who is the one who determined it. But she says, go to your mother's house. It's a euphemism. It's a way of speaking of something that indiscreetly about an indiscreet topic. In Song of Solomon, this phrase is used as well. Song of Solomon, chapter 3, verse 4. Scarcely I had passed him when I found him whom my soul loves. I held him, and I would not let him go until I had brought him into my mother's house, to the place, the chamber of her who conceived me. Can you get the drift? She wants her daughters to have a husband and to go in and have a baby. This is what she's most concerned about. She wants children for these two dear women that she loves. She wants babies. So she tells these two daughters, be smart. Think. You need to get married and you need to have kids before you're too old to do so. And if you go back to Judah with me, you're not going to get it. Not going to happen. Now, the initial response by these two, verse 9, is she kisses them, and they lifted up their voices and they wept because they love her and she loves them. They're grieving. They say, no. We're going to stay with you. And this is clear that they want to go with her. They're on their way back. They've already made the decision to go. But Naomi's saying, no, you can't. And so if this first initial urging by Naomi is sweet, it's tender, it's urging, she turns a little harsh here when they say, no, we're going to go with you. And they said to her, no, verse 10, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said to them, now we have the response, turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may have become husbands? Look, I am too old. I don't have a husband. I'm too old. I am past childbearing age. And then even if I do, for some miraculous way, like Sarah, God gives me a baby tonight, even if the most incredible thing happened right now, are you really going to wait 18 years? You're probably going to be past childbearing age at that point. There's no possibility. There is zero hope here. Now, the way things would normally work, and the reason why she's saying this is if a daughter, in this case, where if a son dies, then the brother should marry the deceased's widow, the brother's widow, so that the line can continue, right? It's social security. But there's no option here. In other words, my dear daughters, there's no hope for you if you go back. Not only is no one going to want you there because you're Moabites, but there's no way I can take care of you either. It's over. Don't stay. And besides, no, second half of verse 13, no, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me for your sake. Or perhaps another way of reading that, it is so bitter for me, you should not participate in it. Life is bitter for me. I am a bereft woman. I got no hope. And you know what? You still have a possibility to have a good life. Don't drown in my world. No, go. All that waits for you is pain, loneliness, and humiliation. It's not possible. For the Lord's hand has gone out against me. God has done this to me. So I'm bitter. It's a form of anger. Because God is against me, she thinks. The final response then comes from the two girls in verse 14. Orpah says, I'll go. They lift up their voices and they weep again because they love each other. But Orpah decides to go. This section is the introduction to the book. no marriage, no babies, no future, no joy, just bigotry is what Naomi has laid before them. Why all the weeping? Did that strike you a little bit as you read through here? They weep like 3 times. Why so emotional? Why all this kind of touchy-feely stuff going on? I mean, maybe you're a girl and you think it's great. I don't know. But do you hear the emotion? Verses 1 through 5, life is pain, but what God's doing. And now here we see the critical turn. And what the author wants you to not think is that none of the 3 actually, that what Ruth is about to choose has nothing to do with devotion to Naomi. That Orpah loves Naomi just as much. We could easily misread what Ruth is about to say and say, oh, well, Ruth just loved her more. No, they all love each other deeply, just as much. Naomi, you could argue, is being the more respectful daughter-in-law. Her mother-in-law is telling her very clearly, very strongly, this is my will for you. You need to go back. That's not a bad call. It makes sense. She's honoring her by leaving, doing what she said. No, she loves Ruth just as much, Naomi just as much. This is why they're weeping. Take the emotion out. Sentimentality is not how we need to be reading this. They both love Naomi, and Naomi loves them both. Because Naomi is, in a sense, Naomi telling him to go is like she's hanging herself here. There's no hope back here. She cares about them. And the 2 daughters, how they're weeping. Remember, they were willing to go. This is not back in Moab. This is on the border of Israel, if not in Israel. No, they've already decided to go. They both love her. So when she urges again, in Ruth, in this point, and Ruth has her final decision, you need to see that this is not just sentimentality. This is not emotionalism at this moment. This is a decision of the will. It is the turning point of the entire book, right here. Verse 15. And Naomi she said, see, to Ruth, your sister-in-law has gone back. Now notice the change in language. She has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. And Ruth makes this statement that I really need you to hear. I need you to think for a moment. Because the style is different, even though you may not see it. It is poetic. This next 2 verses, actually 3 verses, 16, 17, and 15, 16, and 17. All of what Ruth says is in a poem form. If I could print this Bible, as they do in Genesis, where you'll see some places where they'll indent it, and it looks like poem, because that's what's happening here. It's a structure called chiasm. And what it does is it's like a show tune in the middle of a movie. Have you ever seen that, where they're going along here and they suddenly break out in song? If you know those movies well, you realize that what they're doing in that moment is something that makes you stop and think, because they're saying something really important in that moment. And the same thing happens in the Bible, is when they're going along and they suddenly stop the narrative and they actually insert a poem in that spot, is a critical piece of information. And that's exactly what's going on here. It's very stylized. Now, if you can take it with me, if you can think with me for a moment, what we see here is 5 lines. One, if you can, in your mind, line them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right? In a block form. The first and the last go together stylistically, and the middle, the third, the second and the fourth go together, which leads to the third right in the middle. Let me read it and you'll see what I'm saying. Verse 16. Ruth said to her, "Do not judge me, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more, if anything but death parts me from you." The first is an urging. Don't urge me. The last line is an oath. They go together. Stop urging me. May the Lord do with me whatever. And then in between this, you have two verbal pairs. There's verbs in this. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Paired with, where you die, I will die. They go together. Oath and urging. Two verbal pairs, which leads to the very center, the heart of the whole thing. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. And what's interesting here is there are verbs in this, but not that center piece. Most of our translations, to make it readable, says it, your people will be mine, but it literally reads like this: your people, my people. Your God, my God. Why am I highlighting all of this? It's because when you have that structure, and it's very frequent in the Bible, very, very frequent, very, very common. Even Jesus uses it. It's very common in Jewish literature. Is when you have that structure where you have pairs like this, and you have that center one, the point is the middle one. That's the heart of the entire thing. This is the emphasis. The emphasis of what Ruth is saying is, your people are my people. Your God is my God. And the reason why I'm pointing out the fact that it's not, that there's no verb here, is she's not pledging that one day it will be her people. No, it's already occurred. It's a decision that she has made a long time ago. This is perhaps arguably the greatest declaration of conversion in the entire Old Testament. It's so clear. So you have this declaration: your people are my people, your God are my people. Therefore, I will go where you go. Therefore, I'm going to die where you die. Faith in action. So stop urging me, and the Lord can do whatever He wants with me, because I have cast my lot with Him. That's what she's saying. She has decided that God, the true God of Israel, is her God. This is the same thing as what Paul says in the Thessalonians, that they have turned from idols to serve the living and true God. That's this. She has turned from the idols of Moab. She has turned from the false worship. She has decided that this is where I take my stand. So, Naomi, why would I leave you? These are my people. This is my God. I'm not going to go back to them. They're not true. This is who I serve. I can't do anything else. It doesn't matter if it's Yahweh plus nothing. He's true. And by the way, this should settle one of the questions we struggle with, is you cannot separate becoming a Christian from joining His people. They go together. It's always been that way. If you want to be a follower of Jesus, if you want to worship His Father, which is what a Christian is, that means you are a part of the community of faith. That's what you are. It's the same thing. You can't take one without the other. She can't say, your God is my God, but your people are not my people. See how absurd that sounds? This is the heart of the book. This is why the book is called Ruth. And so Naomi decides, I'm letting it go. Now, here very briefly, what are some implications? Here's the first. You don't know who's watching you. Because somewhere along the line, Naomi, who's never left her faith, she still believes in God, even though she thinks he's against him. But somewhere along the line, Ruth believed. Somewhere in all those days of working in the fields or working in the kitchen, Ruth believed Naomi's God. But perhaps the biggest one is just this. As you read through the rest of the book, it doesn't take long for you to do it, you will see that all of the blessings are going to flow through Ruth. For Naomi, for Ruth herself, and for you. Because what happened? They end up going to the land, and it's through Ruth who finds Boaz, who takes care of both Ruth and Naomi, who in the end becomes her husband. They have a child so they are saved in that moment, in this life, but beyond that, he becomes the king of Israel. Their great-grandson becomes King David, the greatest king of Israel, who is part of the line of Jesus, who saves you, who saves Ruth, who saves Naomi. And it all happens through this moment of Ruth saying, your God is my God. Blessings flow through faith. And they may be completely hidden from you today. You may not know what your faith is going to generate. The way the blessings down the line, because did Ruth in this moment know what was going to happen to her? Did Naomi believe that in any way, shape, or form this declaration of her daughter-in-law would be her salvation? No. Not only did she not know it in this present tense and in her own life, she had no idea that would occur. But beyond that, did she have any clue that one of her grandkids would rule the nation of Israel? No. And should she certainly have any idea that her own soul would be saved because of the faith of her daughter-in-law? No. My dear people, if there's one thing I can tell you on how to respond to the tragedies in your life, it's this. Have faith in God. That's it. That's the message in its most critical piece of the book of Ruth, is that the blessings will flow through faith. And those blessings may never be seen by you in this life, but it will come. That's what's going on here. So trust in Jesus. You can argue with him, you can wrestle with him, and that's fine. But believe that that those blessings will come, that God will be faithful to you because of your faith. Even if they're utterly hidden and you'll never see them. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for the fact that you still love us, that you are not our enemy. You are not Naomi's enemy. You are not Ruth's enemy. You are not our enemy. Oh, Jesus, help us to trust you. You are our good shepherd who loves us. You are our good shepherd who in the very midst of all of this stuff is working. And we may not understand what's going on, and you may never tell us in this life what you've been doing. But God, help us to trust you, to choose you plus nothing, believing that your good hand will follow us. In Jesus' name.